The sun rose over the quiet hills of Ridgewood Valley, washing the landscape in golden light. At the far edge of the community, where the paved streets turned to gravel and the HOA's reach began to fade, stood a man named Samuel Holt, a carpenter, a craftsman, and a man of simple pride. His hands had built homes, fences, and bridges for nearly every neighbor in the area. But now, after years of serving others, he finally wanted to build something for himself, a barn. Not just any barn, but a grand one, a place where his tools, his projects, and his legacy could live. The land he owned stretched for 5 acres, marked by an old oak tree and bordered by fields of whispering grass. He'd purchased it long before the HOA expanded their boundaries. To him it was more than property, it was history, peace, and independence. He designed the barn himself, tall wooden beams, stone foundations, and a handcrafted weather vane on top. Every plank carried a story, every nail a mark of his patience. When it stood completed, it wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of his life's work, solid, honest, unshakable. But beauty in the eyes of the HOA wasn't defined by craftsmanship. It was defined by uniformity, rules, regulations, and arbitrary standards dressed as community improvement. From the moment the barn stood finished, the board's attention sharpened. The president of the HOA, Leonard Price, was a man obsessed with control. He viewed Samuel's barn not as a work of art but as defiance. It stood taller than any home in the subdivision, and to Leonard that was an eyesore. The first letter came 2 weeks later, neatly folded, printed in corporate fonts, and delivered by hand. It accused Samuel of violating height restrictions and constructing without proper aesthetic approval. The tone was polite, but the message was clear: tear it down or face consequences. Samuel read it under the fading porch light that evening, the smell of sawdust still clinging to his hands. He said nothing to anyone. The next morning he simply went back to work, sanding a beam, adjusting the hinges, perfecting his creation. Weeks passed, more letters followed, each one colder, more demanding. Neighbors began whispering. Some admired his defiance, others feared the HOA's wrath. Trucks drove by slowly, board members taking photos, inspecting, measuring. Samuel never spoke a word to them. His silence frustrated them more than argument ever could. Then came the fine, $1,000, escalating weekly until compliance was achieved. But Samuel didn't pay. He knew something the HOA didn't, something locked deep within that barn. The structure wasn't just storage. It held records, files, and photographs he'd gathered over the years, evidence of misused HOA funds, shady property deals, and bribes exchanged under the table. Samuel had been quiet, yes, but he had always been watching. The barn, in truth, was more than a workshop. It was a vault. Hidden beneath the floorboards in a sealed compartment was everything needed to bring the entire board to its knees. The HOA escalated further. They held meetings without him, passed votes in his absence, and eventually filed a court injunction. But their arrogance blinded them. They didn't know Samuel had already documented every illegal move they'd made. Still, he waited. He wanted them to dig their own grave first. When the county inspector arrived one morning, clipboard in hand, Samuel greeted him calmly. The man read off the list of violations, snapping photos of every inch. Samuel stood silent, only nodding. The inspector seemed uneasy. He'd heard stories about the carpenter at the edge of town, the man who built things that lasted longer than laws themselves. That night, as the wind howled through the valley, Samuel sat alone inside his barn, staring at the heavy wooden door. He ran his hands across the grain of the timber and smiled faintly. Every storm begins with a whisper. The HOA thought they'd found a rule breaker. What they'd actually done was awaken a strategist, a man who built more than barns. He built plans, and his plan was only beginning. The following weeks turned Ridgewood Valley into a quiet battlefield. The HOA's campaign against Samuel Holt grew louder, colder, and more relentless. Letters turned into legal threats, threats turned into action, and the carpenter's barn, his life's work, became the symbol of rebellion the board could not tolerate. Leonard Price, the HOA president, stood behind every motion filed, every notice mailed. To him, this was not about one man's barn, it was about control. The sight of that towering red structure beyond the picket fences infuriated him. It stood as a monument of defiance against his perfect little community, and Leonard was determined to make an example out of Samuel. Samuel, however, remained still as stone. He continued to rise with the dawn, working in silence, hammering, sanding, maintaining. The barn was his fortress now, both literally and symbolically. Inside, beneath its timber frame, he had reinforced walls, hidden compartments, and boxes of carefully preserved documents. Old receipts, fraudulent permits, emails he had printed and stored, evidence of an HOA gone rotten from the inside out. Every nail he drove into that barn was a reminder of what was coming. Every plank of wood was part of his strategy. Then came the inspections. The HOA began sending committees, groups of neatly dressed neighbors clutching clipboards in self-importance, to evaluate his compliance. They snapped photos, measured walls, and argued among themselves, trying to find any angle of violation they could twist into a fine. Samuel said nothing. He simply stood there, wiping his hands on his apron, letting them wander. The more they searched, the more frustrated they became. To their eyes, the barn was flawless, clean, structurally sound, even artistic. But Leonard was not interested in craftsmanship. He was interested in submission. And Samuel refused to give him that satisfaction. Soon after, the HOA called a community meeting. They gathered in the Ridgewood Hall, the fluorescent lights humming above the crowd of whispering residents. At the center, Leonard spoke with practiced authority, painting Samuel as a reckless man endangering property values and breaking trust. He waved photos of the barn like evidence in a trial, his voice dripping with moral superiority. But the crowd was divided. Many had known Samuel for decades. He had fixed their doors, built their decks, repaired their fences, often without charging a dime. They didn't see him as a villain. They saw a man quietly standing his ground against a system that had forgotten the meaning of community. By the meeting's end, tension hung thick as smoke. The board voted unanimously to proceed with legal action and order to demolish the barn within 30 days. The papers were signed. The countdown had begun. Samuel received the notice at sunset the next day. He read it once, folded it neatly, and tucked it into a drawer inside his workshop. His face didn't change, but in his chest something hardened. He knew the storm had reached its peak, and that meant his counterstrike was near. Over the next week, strange things began happening in Ridgewood Valley. An anonymous package appeared at the county records office containing photocopies of questionable HOA invoices. Then another package sent to the local newspaper exposing discrepancies in HOA tax filings. Each document was real, each one traced back to Leonard and his board. The leaks spread like wildfire. Residents began asking questions. The board panicked, blaming outsiders, hackers, or even former members. They didn't suspect Samuel because to them he was just a quiet carpenter with a stubborn streak. But every night, under the glow of a single hanging bulb, Samuel prepared his next move. The hidden compartment beneath his barn floor was now filled with manila folders, hard drives, and flash drives, decades of secrets he had gathered through quiet observation and a few trusted allies who despised the HOA as much as he did. One night, as the rain lashed against the barn walls, Samuel sat at his workbench, writing a letter addressed to the people of Ridgewood Valley. It was not angry or vengeful. It was calm, factual, undeniable. It outlined how HOA funds had been misused, how residents' fees had paid for private vacations and political donations. It was truth carved from wood and paper, meant to splinter their illusion of authority. He sealed the letter and set it aside. The barn creaked under the weight of the wind, but it felt alive, as if it too was waiting for what came next. Days later, HOA officials arrived again, this time with a demolition notice pinned to a clipboard. The order was official. The date was set. The barn would be torn down in 7 days. The men who came to deliver the notice left feeling uneasy. They couldn't shake the way Samuel had looked at them, not with anger but with something colder, something knowing. The countdown had begun. The HOA thought they had won, but Samuel Holt was not done building. He was only beginning to reveal what he had built inside. The days leading up to the demolition were heavy with silence, a suffocating calm that spread across Ridgewood Valley like the pause before a storm. The HOA's notices had stopped coming, the inspectors no longer drove by, and even the gossip among neighbors seemed to have gone quiet. It wasn't peace. It was anticipation. Everyone was waiting to see what Samuel Holt would do next. To most of them, he was a man standing on the edge of defeat, a solitary carpenter clinging to a dream the HOA had already crushed. But beneath the rough planks of his barn, hidden from every prying eye, was something far greater than wood and nails. At the heart of the barn, a large oak workbench stood as the centerpiece of Samuel's craft, but beneath it, built into the floor, lay a concealed hatch. The door was reinforced with metal brackets, and sealed with a false layer of wood grain so convincing that no inspector could ever notice. Samuel had crafted it years earlier, not out of paranoia, but out of principle. He believed in building things that could outlast deceit. Now that hidden space held the soul of his revenge. Stacks of boxes lined the underground chamber, each labeled, dated, and organized with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle. Inside them were the HOA's sins. Photographs of Leonard Price shaking hands with contractors who had overbilled the community for thousands. Copies of internal memos detailing budget adjustments that mysteriously disappeared into private accounts. Bank records showing funds transferred to shell companies. And most damning of all, video footage. Years ago, when Samuel had helped repair the Ridgewood Hall's floorboards, he had quietly installed a small recording device beneath the stage. It had captured dozens of board meetings over the years, including several where Leonard and his allies discussed illegal votes, forged documents, and personal favors traded for silence. Samuel hadn't planned to use it, not then, but he had always believed that truth should have a place to hide and one day a reason to rise. Now that reason had come. Every night Samuel descended into that secret chamber and worked under the dim light of a single bulb. He scanned documents, uploaded files, and sent them to encrypted folders under anonymous names. He created backups, one for the press, one for the state attorney's office, and one that would automatically send if he didn't log in for 3 days. He wasn't just defending his barn. He was dismantling an empire of corruption, one bite at a time. Outside, the world continued its slow spin toward destruction day. HOA board members were restless. Leonard, in particular, had begun to lose sleep. He could feel the shift, the town's quiet discontent, the whispers that wouldn't stop, the fear that maybe the carpenter knew more than he should. He doubled the HOA's legal efforts, called emergency meetings, and ordered private security to guard the demolition crew when the time came. He didn't know why he felt threatened, only that he did. Meanwhile, Samuel spent his days making the barn look ordinary. He replaced loose boards, swept the floors, and worked on small wooden trinkets as if he were still a man resigned to his fate. But every hammer strike, every measured cut was part of a greater rhythm, the rhythm of a man preparing to reveal the truth at the perfect moment. 3 days before demolition, a small envelope arrived at the local newspaper. Inside were 5 photographs, a USB drive, and a handwritten note. "If they destroy my barn, you'll understand why they had to." The editor didn't know who sent it, but when they opened the files, they found images that couldn't be ignored: HOA board members signing off on fake invoices, private meetings held in secret, and a photo of Leonard Price receiving an envelope of cash behind the town hall. It was enough to raise questions, not accusations, not yet. But questions spread faster than any order could contain. By sunset, whispers turned to speculation. By midnight, speculation became outrage. The Ridgewood Valley community group online exploded with debates, screenshots, and half-truths. The once feared HOA was suddenly under a different kind of spotlight, one they couldn't control. Still, Leonard refused to back down. He called the demolition company personally, confirming the date, time, and crew. "We finished this," he told them. "No delays." As the last night before demolition arrived, Samuel sat inside his barn, listening to the rain tapping against the roof. The smell of oil, wood, and dust filled the air. His entire life's work surrounded him, not just the barn, but the legacy of honesty he had built board by board. He placed his hand on the floorboards and whispered a silent promise to the land itself, that the truth buried beneath it would see daylight, no matter what came next. He had already sent the final upload, a complete digital archive of every file, set to release publicly at noon the next day, the exact hour the demolition crew was scheduled to arrive. When dawn broke, the valley was wrapped in fog. Trucks rumbled in the distance, their engines echoing through the hills. The HOA had come to destroy him. But they didn't know that every swing of their hammer would also strike the walls of their own deception. Because beneath those wooden floors, waiting, silent and unshakable, the truth was ready to rise. The morning of the demolition dawned gray and heavy. Clouds hung low over Ridgewood Valley, muting the sunlight that usually poured across the hills. It was as if the sky itself knew something was about to break. By 7 o'clock, the HOA's hired crew had arrived, a small convoy of trucks carrying demolition equipment, generators, and portable barriers. The HOA board stood nearby, wrapped in raincoats and self-importance, huddled under umbrellas as if shielding themselves from the judgment of the land itself. Leonard Price was at the front, barking orders, his expression tight and triumphant. This was his victory day, the moment he would finally erase the defiance that had haunted his perfect neighborhood. Samuel Holt was already there, standing by the gate of his property. He wasn't armed, he wasn't shouting, and he didn't bring anyone to protest. He simply stood silent as the oak tree behind him, watching the crew set up. His expression was unreadable, calm to the point of unsettling. Leonard's voice cut through the damp air, demanding Samuel step aside. The workers hesitated, glancing between the two men. Samuel nodded slowly, unlatched the gate, and opened it wide. Without a word, he let them in. The message was clear: go ahead. The demolition foreman gave a nervous nod to his team. They started their engines. The rumble of machinery filled the valley, echoing off the hillsides like thunder. The barn loomed ahead, proud, stoic, defiant. Its red paint glistened with dew, its heavy doors locked tight, its roof towering above the workers like a monument carved from time itself. But what none of them knew was that the barn was already wired, not for destruction but for revelation. Inside, motion sensors and small hidden cameras had been set the night before. Every movement, every word spoken on that property was being recorded and streamed live to a private link Samuel had sent to one local journalist and 3 state investigators. As the first blows landed against the outer wall, Samuel turned away and began walking toward his porch. The ground trembled beneath his boots. He could hear the crack of timber, the splintering of beams, the dull roar of machines biting into wood. To most, it sounded like loss. To Samuel, it sounded like truth waking up. Across town at the Ridgewood Gazette, the editor received an email alert with the subject line, "They've started." Attached was a live feed link. When the editor clicked it, the screen filled with the image of the barn and the HOA board standing proudly in front of it. The caption below read, "Ridgewood HOA demolishes private property without due process, watch live." Within minutes, hundreds were watching, then thousands. Back at the site, as the machines tore deeper, they struck something unexpected, a layer of metal reinforcement beneath the wood. Sparks flew. The foreman frowned, stepping closer to inspect. He knocked on the beam, confused. It was no ordinary barn foundation. It was fortified steel. Leonard shouted for them to continue, growing impatient. "It's just an old man's trick," he yelled. But the workers hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong, unnatural. One of them noticed the small red light glowing faintly in the corner of the doorway, a camera lens, then another, then several more. Suddenly the barn's main door creaked open. The sound silenced everything: the engines, the voices, the very air itself. Slowly the heavy door swung wide, revealing the inside. No one moved. Inside the barn, on a large wooden table, lay a single box. Next to it, a handwritten note. On the box was stamped one word: evidence. Leonard froze. The cameras caught every second, his confusion, his panic, his trembling breath. Samuel stood at the edge of the field watching, his face unreadable as ever. The foreman approached the box cautiously. He lifted the lid and looked inside: papers, photographs, receipts, documents covered in HOA letterheads. Every single one pointed to corruption, theft, and fraud. He turned to Leonard, horrified. "Sir, you need to see this." But Leonard didn't move. His face had gone pale, his umbrella trembling in his hand. He realized too late that the trap had already closed. Across the valley, phones buzzed. The live stream shifted, showing close-ups of the documents. Viewers could read everything: account numbers, signatures, dates, Leonard's own handwriting on a check issued to a company that didn't exist. The truth wasn't hidden anymore. It was public, undeniable, and permanent. Mirrored across social platforms and local board members scrambled. People of Ridgewood Valley were watching, and they finally knew. Shut down. Police cars appeared by mid-afternoon, their sirens slicing through the thick silence. Officers moved through the property, securing the area, confiscating documents, and questioning the HOA members. Samuel didn't resist. He simply handed over the keys to the barn and nodded toward the open box. By evening, Leonard Price was in handcuffs, led away past the crowd that had gathered at the gates. Cameras flashed, residents whispered. The once untouchable HOA president now looked small and hollow beneath the gray sky. The barn still stood, damaged but not fallen. Its frame had survived the assault, its structure too strong to collapse completely. It was scarred, but it stood tall, much like the man who built it. As night descended, the last of the police cars rolled away. The valley was quiet again. Samuel sat on his porch, watching the faint glow of lanterns flicker across his field. The barn was wounded but victorious. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The battle had ended, but the aftermath, the reckoning, was just beginning. The next morning, Ridgewood Valley woke to a different kind of dawn. The same hills, the same roads, the same neat little lawns, but the air had changed. The silence carried something heavier than fog. It carried truth. The news had spread far beyond the valley overnight. The story of the barn that exposed the HOA made its way onto local television, online headlines, and social media feeds across the state. Images of Leonard Price in handcuffs flashed everywhere, his face a perfect portrait of arrogance undone. The once feared HOA board had become the town's shame. Neighbors who had once whispered behind Samuel Holt's back now gathered at the edge of his land, staring in awe at the half-broken barn that refused to fall. It stood like a monument to everything they had lost, and everything they had ignored. For years they had let the HOA dictate their lives, enforce petty rules, and steal their freedom under the guise of community improvement. Now they saw the truth of it all, laid bare by a single man with calloused hands and quiet resolve. Investigators from the county arrived by noon. They combed through the barn, collecting every file, photograph, and recording device. Samuel had cataloged everything meticulously. Each folder was labeled with dates, signatures, and chain of custody notes. The officers were astonished. It was as if he had built a miniature archive of justice inside those walls. The evidence was overwhelming: embezzlement, forgery, coercion, misuse of community funds. Leonard Price and several board members faced multiple charges. Their emails and meeting transcripts revealed years of corruption, illegal property assessments, inflated maintenance fees, and personal enrichment disguised as neighborhood development. And through it all, Samuel remained silent. He didn't seek interviews, didn't boast, didn't gloat. When a reporter tried to approach him on his porch, he simply said, "The truth builds itself if you give it time." Then he turned away and went back to repairing a cracked window frame. Behind closed doors, the HOA dissolved in chaos. Members resigned in waves, terrified of being implicated. Homeowners who had once feared retaliation began demanding their money back. The Ridgewood Valley office, once polished and proud, became a ghost building overnight, its signs stripped from the wall, its locks changed by county order. But for Samuel, victory wasn't celebration. It was silence. The kind of silence that comes after thunder, when everything feels still but the world isn't quite the same. He spent the following week restoring the barn. Broken panels were replaced, damaged beams were straightened. He refused to let it die. For him, it wasn't just about a structure, it was about meaning. The barn was proof that truth could withstand fire, steel, and lies. Neighbors began to help. At first they came hesitantly: a retired mechanic, a young mother, a few old friends who had once avoided his calls. They brought nails, paint, and tools. One by one they offered their hands. Together they rebuilt what greed had tried to destroy. It became more than a barn, it became a gathering place, a symbol, a story that would live long after the wood turned gray. But Leonard Price's downfall was not the end. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Ridgewood's corruption wasn't isolated, it was part of a much larger chain. Leonard had been funneling money to a regional HOA council, a web of false invoices that stretched across several communities. Samuel's discovery triggered a statewide investigation. Within weeks, multiple arrests followed. Lawyers called it the Ridgewood Files. Residents called it justice in wood. And while the world was talking, Samuel stayed right where he'd always been, on his land, among his tools, under the open sky. He didn't need fame, he didn't need thanks. The barn spoke for him. Months passed, the valley began to change. Without the HOA's grip, people started to live freely again. They built what they wanted, painted their homes in colors they loved, planted gardens instead of manicured lawns. For the first time in years, Ridgewood Valley felt like a community, not a prison with fences and rules. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Samuel stood outside the barn's new doors. The red paint gleamed in the fatting light. The field was quiet except for the soft hum of crickets. He leaned against the wooden frame, breathing in the scent of pine and earth. He had won, but not through violence or anger. He had won through patience, evidence, and faith in truth. And yet, deep down, he knew something larger had begun. The press still wanted to interview him, officials wanted to honor him, but Samuel didn't build barns for recognition, he built them to last. The wind shifted, brushing past the tall grass, whispering through the rafters. The barn seemed to breathe, alive, defiant, eternal. From his porch, Samuel could see the lights of Ridgewood Valley flickering in the distance. The people were free now, but freedom, he knew, was fragile like wood. It needed care, maintenance, and hands willing to rebuild it when it cracked. The reckoning had come, and justice had been carved into the valley's soil. But stories like this never end in one place. Truth, once set free, spreads like fire through dry grass. And somewhere beyond those hills, another community was already whispering about a carpenter's barn, the one that broke an empire and taught a lesson the world wouldn't forget. Seasons turned slowly in Ridgewood Valley. The sharp edges of scandal began to soften, replaced by the hum of normal life. The grass grew back where the machines had torn the earth. And wildflowers bloomed again along the fence line. Yet the story of what happened there, the story of the carpenter and his barn, refused to fade. It had rooted itself deep into the town's memory, like the oak tree that stood beside Samuel Holt's porch. By the time spring rolled around, the barn had become something sacred. People began to visit not as tourists but as witnesses. They came quietly, some with curiosity, others with gratitude. The once feared site of defiance now stood as a monument to truth, a reminder that even in small places, integrity could rise taller than greed. Samuel never charged anyone who came. He didn't tell his story, he simply let the barn speak for itself. Its red walls gleamed in the sunlight and the scent of cedar hung thick in the air. Inside, a new addition stood near the back, a single wooden plaque carved by Samuel himself. It read, "Truth doesn't burn, it only reveals." Beneath the plaque hung a framed photograph, the barn as it once stood, untouched, proud and new. Next to it, a second frame held the newspaper clipping that had changed everything. HOA scandal exposed by local carpenter. Over time, the barn became more than a symbol. It became a gathering place for those who wanted to rebuild what corruption had broken. Farmers, builders, and townsfolk began holding meetings there, discussing fair land rights and honest governance. They called it the Ridgewood Assembly. Samuel rarely spoke during those meetings. He'd sit near the back listening, his hands folded, his eyes calm. He was no longer the target of the HOA, no longer the man under siege. He was the man who reminded others that freedom could only survive when someone was willing to stand alone for it. Leonard Price and his allies were long gone by then. Their trials had concluded with heavy sentences and public disgrace. The money they'd stolen was partially recovered and used to repair the town's public works, but even after justice was served, their names carried the weight of what greed had cost. Samuel had never spoken ill of them. When asked how he felt about their downfall, his answer was always the same: they built their house on lies, it was bound to collapse. By late summer, the county officially dissolved the Ridgewood HOA. The remaining homeowners voted to form a new community council, one without fines, without intimidation, and without hidden ledgers. They invited Samuel to lead it. He declined. He told them leadership wasn't about control, it was about faith, the kind that trusts people to build their own fences, paint their own homes, and choose their own peace. Still, they named him Honorary Steward of Ridgewood Valley, a title he accepted with a nod and a rare smile. As months passed, his barn began to inspire people far beyond Ridgewood. Journalists, activists, and homeowners from across the country reached out, sharing their own battles against corruption and control. Many credited Samuel's story as the spark that helped them fight back. A quiet movement began to take shape, one built not on anger but on resilience. Samuel never joined any of it. He preferred the quiet rhythm of woodwork, the rasp of a file, the steady tap of a hammer, the smell of pine and varnish. He believed in creation, not confrontation. Every now and then, when the valley was still, he'd walk out to the barn and stand in the doorway, watching the sunlight fall across the floorboards. The steel reinforcements beneath his feet remained untouched, a secret foundation that would outlast him. He had built the barn to hold his tools, but in the end it had held something far greater, proof that even one man standing alone could turn truth into structure. As the years passed, children grew up hearing the story of the man who built the unbreakable barn. Parents told it around campfires and community gatherings, not as legend, but as warning that power without honesty always meets its reckoning. And though the world moved on, the legacy remained, carved into every plank and post. The barn had survived the storm, the lies, and the fall of the ones who tried to erase it. One autumn evening, when the fields turned gold and the air was sharp with the scent of harvest, Samuel sat on his porch for the last time. He watched the wind move through the grass and listened to the creak of the barn's wooden beams. The land was peaceful again. He had done what he came to do. When the morning came, his chair was empty, his tools neatly arranged on the table. The townsfolk found him in his workshop, a faint smile on his face as if he had simply drifted off mid-thought. They buried him beneath the oak tree beside the barn, the same tree that had watched everything unfold. On his headstone, the community carved the words he had once spoken quietly to a neighbor: "A man's work is only as strong as the truth that holds it together." Years later, when storms rolled through the valley, lightning struck and winds tore across the land. Fences broke, trees fell, but the barn, Samuel's barn, stood untouched. The people began to say the wood itself remembered, and maybe it did, because some things once built with truth can never truly fall.